Hello and welcome. I am Melanie Ross, and I will be the facilitator of our webinar this afternoon. Our presenter is Keith Mowry. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on the 2024 National Conformity Assessment Case Study in Review. Please note that we are recording this webinar, so it will be available on the ANAB website for viewing in the future. Some logistics before we get started. As is customary with our webinars, all attendees will remain muted. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that are asked. About our presenter today, Keith Mowry is the Senior Manager, Business Development at ANAB. He has over 30 years of experience with ISO standards and guides for conformity assessment. He has authored the 2023 National Conformity Assessment Case Study and has developed the 2024 case study results. With that, I am going to turn it over to Keith for his portion of the presentation.
Well, thanks so much. Oh, I beg your pardon. Thanks so much, Melanie. And welcome everybody to the webinar, and a welcome to those of you who are listening to the webinar as a recorded a webinar after either participating in the case study or using the case study when it's available as public information. Just to quickly review, when we approached the case study, we thought about the case study as a particular instance of something used or analyzed to illustrate a thesis or a principle. And so the first part of the 2024 case study was a particular instance of conformity assessment. It was a narrative, and I used very common, ordinary language to describe the narrative. I wanted it to be like real life information that you might find on the web or in media. And this narrative or story is complete but fictitious, and it is a conformity assessment solution. And the idea I want to get across here is that when conformity assessment is actually practiced, it's a solution to a problem. So in our case study, if we think about it in those terms, as we read the narrative, what we're looking for is a problem that's being solved by conformity assessment. And first we meet Ann Lersick. And Ann has solved a problem. She had a nurse retention problem in her healthcare system, and she came up with a solution for that, a particular way of managing nurses, the Lersick nurse management process. So that was a solution to a problem, but it was not a conformity assessment solution. It wasn't a demonstration of fulfillment of specified requirements. And we also meet the business development department at the healthcare system, the Ridge Valley healthcare system, and we learn about their work to license this nurse management process to other healthcare systems. Now, they're not really solving a problem, they're trying to take advantage of an opportunity. And this general approach, this general narrative that you read, has similarities to one particular kind of business activity, and that's franchising. And I wanted to use an example this year of an area of activity that had a lot of conformity assessment related to it, but is sometimes unacknowledged or it's hard to recognize. Usually conformity assessment in franchising is a little hard to see because the interested parties and the people doing conformity assessment are the franchisor and the franchisees. So unless you're inside that community, you might not see it. So we have the business development department, and they're busy licensing this nurse management process to other healthcare systems, and things are going along just great until a problem arises. And the nature of that problem is pretty serious because it could ruin the reputation of this nurse management process. And the problem is that some of the healthcare systems that are licensing the process aren't implementing it fully or not implementing it at all, but they're out there in the market claiming that they are. Whereas other licensees are fully implementing it, and the nurses who are being managed in accordance with that process are getting those benefits. So the business development department creates a solution to differentiate the sayers the ones who say they're doing it, from the doers, from the ones who are doing it. And this solution is in the form of a demonstration that specified requirements are fulfilled. It is a conformity assessment solution. Now, this is a voluntary solution, right? The business development department is not mandating that all the licensees go through this. It's offering it as voluntary. However, the market benefits of going through this conformity assessment for the healthcare system licensees include attracting candidates for their nursing positions. And that's a big deal with nurses being in short supply. So the costs of completing this conformity assessment are more than justified by those market benefits of being an attractive place for nurses to work. And so it's a voluntary approach because the incentives to perform the conformity assessment and the benefits outweigh those costs. So the conformity assessment is likely to be initiated and sustained. So from this perspective, right, from this perspective that we have a problem and we have a conformity assessment solution, we see that the first 4 paragraphs, the first half of the narrative, the story, describes the problem. And the last 2 paragraphs, the second half of the narrative, that describes the conformity assessment solution. And for those of you who participated and did the case study, you discovered that the details of the problem had to be understood to correctly answer the questions. That is, to really understand a conformity assessment solution, you need to understand some aspects of the problem that it's solving. And this is really a very practical experience in all kinds of situations where you're trying to understand conformity assessment. You need to spend at least some time understanding the problem that conformity assessment is solving. And by doing that, you're going to understand the why. Why is conformity assessment happening? So what were the details of this conformity assessment solution? Well, according to the story, the healthcare systems that are licensing the LURSIC nurse management process, they will choose which areas of their nursing operations will be audited and therefore show full implementation of the management process. Now, these audits will be performed in accordance with a plan and a checklist that the business development department has created and provides. Now, the results of the audits will be checked, and if fulfillment of all the requirements is demonstrated, a letter will be issued describing the areas that were audited, identifying the healthcare system, and the letter will state that there is demonstrated to be a full implementation of the nurse management process. And the letters will be valid for a year. Excuse me. And the copies of letters will also be posted to a website, and that'll help deal with the problem of counterfeit letters. So this solution really will differentiate the sayers from the doers. But another problem arises. In this solution, there's a heavy dependence on auditors and the availability of auditors, as well as their expertise about the management process. And this expertise is in short supply. So we have a second problem, and we need a second solution. So to solve this second problem, the business development department decides to use peers or nurse managers from other licensees, other healthcare systems, to do the audits. Now, these peers, these nurse managers, will be qualified as auditors based on training, testing, and other information. Now, you can see that this is a new solution in the form of a different demonstration that requirements are fulfilled. It is a conformity assessment solution, but it's a different solution to the different problem. And again, like the other solution, this solution is a voluntary solution. The nurse managers who go through this process and become auditors will get some significant benefits. They'll have an acknowledged credential about their expertise about the nurse management system. And when they do audits, they'll have the opportunity to learn about other implementations of this management process. So these benefits we expect will more than overcome the cost of performing the conformity assessment. And so it should trigger and initiate and sustain this conformity assessment solution. So there's the first part of our case study. It's a narrative or a story. It's a description of a problem, and then it's a description of conformity assessment solutions. Now, the second part of the case study, like any case study, is something that's used or analyzed to illustrate a thesis or principle. So in our case study, we used this story to illustrate basic principles of conformity assessment, but we did that through multiple choice questions that you could participate in and answer yourself. Now, the basic principles apply to all of conformity assessment. So the questions were based on basic principles that are not unique to this situation, nor are they unique to any type of conformity assessment. Now, per the instructions in the case study, the participants basically had three sources of information in order to answer the questions. First, they had the case study narrative, what I just described. Second, the instructions indicated that the questions were posed in terms of basic principles, principles that applied to all forms of conformity assessment. So you had that piece of information as well. The third piece of information you were given was that information about these basic principles could be found in ISO IEC 17000. Now, the reason I bring this up today is really, in effect, these three generic sources of information are really what you have as a starting point for analyzing any situation that involves conformity assessment. You can always find information about the problem. Might not be easy, but it's there. You always know that there are basic principles of conformity assessment that always apply. And you always know that the information and description and expertise or knowledge about these basic principles can be found or obtained from ISO IEC 17000. So as you as a conformity assessment professional are analyzing conformity assessment or even developing conformity assessment, basically you always have this same starting point. Now, for participants in the case study, you all have access to a web page that gives you the answers you gave to the questions and the correct answers, as well as a fairly detailed explanation of what those correct answers were. I'm not going to review that in great detail today, but what I am going to do is I'm going to cover a couple of highlights about each of the individual questions. So the first question was, what are the two types of objects of conformity assessment? Now, objects of conformity assessment has a very specific meaning, and it's defined in ISO IEC 17000. And note that this concept of objects of conformity assessment is different from the objectives that conformity assessment is meant to deliver. It's different than the problem that needs to be solved. In our case, objectives of conformity assessment, as in every other case, objects of conformity assessment in our case study were the things that actually fulfilled the requirements. That's what an object of conformity assessment is per 17,000. And in our case, we had two types of things that fulfilled requirements. First, we had implementations of the LRSIC nurse management process. Those individual implementations of that process were audited and demonstrated to fulfill requirements. Second, we had nurse managers as people, and those people were tested and their qualifications were evaluated, and they demonstrated fulfillment of specified requirements. So for question 2, the question was, who is the conformity assessment scheme owner? Well, a scheme per definitions in ISO IEC 17000, is a set of rules and procedures. So a scheme is literally information that is in the form of rules and procedures. And these rules and procedures do three things. They describe the objects of conformity assessment, what I just told you about. They identify the specified requirements, and they provide a methodology, a series of steps or a series of activities for demonstrating that those objects of conformity assessment fulfill the identified specified requirements. So a scheme is information, or if you like, intellectual property. And the scheme owner is the person or organization who is responsible for developing and maintaining that information, developing and maintaining those rules and procedures. Now, usually, but not always, the scheme owner who develops and maintains the information is also the intellectual property owner, but not always. And so let me give you an example of that. Let's say we have a set of rules and procedures for a scheme, and these rules and procedures are developed and maintained in a standard. Okay? So who's the intellectual property owner of the standard? Well, the intellectual property owner is the standard development organization that publishes the standard and provides the process for developing the standard. All right? But who's the scheme owner? Who actually develops and maintains that information? Well, it would be the standards committee that's responsible for that standard. So in that situation, you have a standard or a scheme, a set of rules and procedures, where the owner of the intellectual property is not the same as the scheme owner that develops and maintains it. In question 3, we asked which best describes the conformity assessment bodies. And then there were a series of choices of different persons or organizations. And so the idea here was which of the following is the best description of the conformity assessment bodies in our case study. Now, a conformity assessment body is any person or organization which performs any conformity assessment activity. So to answer this question correctly, you really needed to understand the full breadth of conformity assessment from an ISO IEC 17000 perspective, specifically from the perspective of the functional approach, which is described in the annex to ISO IEC 17000. Now, without that broad perspective, there might be many people who see auditing as the only activity in our case study that relates to these implementations of the nurse management process. And so if you think that's the only conformity assessment activity, you would say, well, the only conformity assessment body is the person or organization that performs that auditing. But the functional approach to conformity assessment is much broader. There are many more activities that fall into the broad description of conformity assessment in ISO IEC 17000. In particular, an activity that is performed by the licensee falls into the functional approach. Specifically, remember the licensee is the organization that decides which parts of their operations are going to be audited. And that action of sampling or deciding what specifically is going to be addressed by the auditing, that is an activity that falls under the functional approach for conformity assessment. As a result, per the definitions in 17,000, that licensee doing that activity is a conformity assessment body. And so the correct answer to this question was the best description of all the persons or organizations that did a conformity assessment activity under the functional approach. Question 4 asked, what statements of conformity are issued? And this was a question to give us a chance to talk about statements of conformity briefly. Per the definitions in 17,000, statements of conformity do not communicate or convey that requirements are fulfilled. Now that might sound a little bit odd, but so let me say it again. Statements of conformity do not convey or communicate that requirements have been fulfilled. A statement of conformity is much broader than that per ISO IEC 17000. A statement of conformity conveys that a demonstration of fulfillment of specified requirements has been successfully completed. So keep in mind that the demonstration is the entire functional approach and involves more than just the step in the middle where we test or inspect or audit or check to find fulfillment of specified requirements. Put another way, the statement of conformity is linked to a specific scheme. So when the market sees a statement of conformity, not only do they see the communication that there's been a demonstration of fulfillment of requirements, the market can also understand that this statement links back to the methodology in that scheme. So the market knows what's standing behind that statement of conformity in terms of the entire methodology for the full range of activities in the functional approach. So in that context, the statements of conformity in our case study really reflected the entire demonstration of fulfillment of specified requirements. Now, the fifth question was, which best characterizes surveillance activities in this conformity assessment scheme? Well, we know from 17,000 that surveillance activities occur after the issuance of a statement of conformity. And the purpose of surveillance activities is to assure the validity of the statement of conformity. The surveillance activities are meant to ensure or assure that this statement, that a demonstration of fulfillment of specified requirements has been successfully completed, the surveillance activities take place to make sure that's still a valid statement. Nothing has changed that would contradict the statement that a successful demonstration has been completed. So surveillance activities are not necessarily a complete new determination of fulfillment of specified requirements. They may just be things to check to make sure that the object of conformity is still being produced or still exists and the original demonstration is still valid. Now, for our case study, there were two different statements of conformity that related to two different objects of conformity assessment. The objects of conformity assessment, again, were the implementations of the nurse management processes in licensees. That was one object of conformity assessment. And the other were the nurse managers seeking to become peer auditors. Now, a statement of conformity was issued about each of those objects. For the implementations of the process, a letter was issued. For the nurse managers, the statement of conformity was the inclusion of their name in a registry of peer auditors that was maintained by the scheme owner. But only one of these statements of conformity was assured on an ongoing basis with surveillance activities. And that was the one for the nurse managers. They had to do some annual activities to maintain their status as a peer auditor. So that was the key to understanding question number 5. So question number 6 asked the participants to rank the conformity assessment activities from the most used activities to the least used activities within this particular case study. And this question is here so we can emphasize activities. ISO IEC 17000 defines first, second, and third party activities. It does not define first, second, and third party bodies. So this question was really about activities. Now, these types of activities, first, second, and third party activities, in ISO IEC 17000, they are specifically defined. And each type of activity is tied to a person or organization with a particular interest in the object of conformity assessment to which the activity pertains. Now, to get this question correct, you needed these definitions in ISO IEC 17000. It's almost impossible to get this correct answer without those specifics. Now, for this year's case study, I wanted to write a case study that was specifically and intentionally emphasizing second-party conformity assessment activities, because these are not usually seen out in the market. We don't usually see these. It doesn't mean they don't exist. I think they exist to a greater extent than either first or third-party activities, frankly, but we just don't see them. They're just not as hard to see. So I wanted to give an illustration of second-party activities in this year's case study, and so those were the most predominant activities. And in the case study, I also wanted to make a point by including no third-party activities. I know there are some people who assume that conformity assessment only happens when there are third-party activities. And I wanted to give a case study that showed an example of very effective and clear conformity assessment activities where there were no third-party activities. In question 7, we asked for some information about the best fit requirements for the conformity assessment bodies performing activities in the case study. Now, the question was, which of the standards would, with some alterations, which of the following standards would be the right or the best requirements for the conformity assessment bodies. So for this one, the key here were the objects of conformity assessment. So we now clear what our two objects of conformity assessment are. One of our objects of conformity assessment was a type of process, a nurse management process. And I tried to make it clear in the case study that this was a management process, not a management system. So one of our objects of conformity was an implementation of this nurse management process. The second object of conformity was a type of person. It was a nurse manager who wanted to become a peer auditor. So if you understood those two types of objects of conformity assessment, and then you either had information or you found information on the internet about the standards that were in the multiple choice answers, you would find that when a process is the object of conformity assessment, of the standards shown, ISO IEC 17065 is the most logical choice for the body performing activities related to that process. Likewise, when the object of conformity assessment is a person, then 17024 is the most likely set of requirements for a body performing conformity assessment activities related to a person as an object of conformity. Now, neither of these two standards set requirements for bodies performing second-party activities or first-party activities. But this is where the alteration comes in. Now, remember the question said, with some alterations, what are the best two standards? Well, the alterations that would be needed are some adjustments within those standards so that their requirements would pertain to bodies performing second-party activities related to a process. That would be an altered 17065. And alterations that would make the standard apply to first and second-party activities related to a person. That would be alterations to 17024. So in question 8, the question was, what primary activities does the scheme owner perform? And notice none of the choices had anything to do with developing or maintaining the scheme. All of the choices had to do with conformity assessment activities. And so this was intentional. In order to find the correct answer, the participant would need to understand that a scheme owner, they would need to know what a scheme owner is, of course, and correctly identify the scheme owner. But in addition to that, they would need to be aware that a scheme owner can also be a conformity assessment body in the same scheme. The scheme owner can itself, perform conformity assessment activities, and vice versa. A conformity assessment body, for example, that performs all the activities in any given scheme can also be the scheme owner. That happens all the time. It's very common. Now, what I chose for the scheme owner to perform the least recognized area of activity within the functional approach. And I did that on purpose so that it would take some digging and it would take some real thinking to answer that question correctly. And that least recognizable function is the review, decision, and attestation function. Now, the ninth question was, what was described in the least amount of detail within the case study narrative? So again, we needed to understand what a scheme was, and we also needed an awareness of the functions in the functional approach, because some of the answers to this question were activities or were one of the functions. Now, this case study, and I did this intentionally. The case study was a specific situation where the specified requirements that were used in the methodology for the objects of conformity assessment, note that those specified requirements were never really described in any detail. They were referenced, right? They were alluded to, but you never really knew exactly what those requirements were. And this is really not a very typical situation. Frankly, when we're looking at a conformity assessment situation, one of the things that we do know is the specified requirements and the content of those requirements. And the types of situations like our case study, where that's not really known, these can be difficult to understand. And the reason is that the details of the specified requirements usually provide context, right? And the context is they help identify the types of objects of conformity assessment. It's very straightforward. The requirements apply to something, and the specified requirements usually tell you what the requirements apply to. What they apply to is your object of conformity assessment. When you know that, you can start to find conformity assessment activities that are performed to demonstrate those objects fulfill those specified requirements. And when you find the activities, now you can start to find the conformity assessment bodies. So I wanted this question and I wanted this aspect of the case study just to point out how valuable the knowledge of the specified requirements can be. And the last question in the case study was, what is the best description of licensing? Now, again, this was very intentional, and I recognize that in many cases, any mention of licensing in any kind of situation where conformity assessment is happening can often be assumed to be part of the conformity assessment activities. As soon as you mention licensing, everybody automatically assumes that's part of the conformity assessment activities. And it's specifically an activity related to the issuance of the statement of conformity. Now, that's not always true. Some people assume that every statement of conformity is issued through a license, but that's not really accurate. So this question was really actually designed for people who had familiarity, particularly with conformity assessment related to marks of conformity. You see, when a mark of conformity is issued, that mark is owned intellectual property, and someone else can only use it generally under some sort of contract or license. So licensing nearly always exists when the statement of conformity is a mark that is authorized for use. But licensing is not usually used for other statements of conformity. In this case, the letters that were issued as a statement of conformity, there was no licensing related to those letters, nor was there any licensing of the statement of conformity, which was the list on the website of all the nurse managers who could serve as peer auditors. So I put licensing into the case study to show that just because licensing is part of a situation doesn't necessarily mean that it's part of or one of the conformity assessment activities. So to kind of finish up, I thought I would give you some numbers to look at. So the total number of participants in the case study this year was 14. And certainly we are hoping for many more participants than that. But I congratulate, really, I really congratulate the people who took the time to read the case study and work through the questions and take full advantage of this event. Now, this is going to be made public information, and so there will be many people who can take this and use this case study for a long time to come, and then they can listen to this webinar to hear some of the commentary that we've talked about today. So on this slide, you can see the questions numbered 1 through 10, and you can see the number of correct responses. So you see there's a pretty wide disparity of how many participants got each standard or each question correct. But despite the low number, right, despite only 14 participants, what we see here is that every single question was answered correctly by at least one participant. So the questions were not completely out of reach. We didn't have any questions that nobody got correctly. And clearly, some questions were easier than others. And the idea was that that was probably the case just based on the level of background or experience that the participant had with conformity assessment or with some of these fundamental principles and concepts. So it wasn't that there's one score that's good and one score that's bad. It's that the idea was the score was to try to give the participants some feedback about where their level of experience and background might be and compare that to their self-perception. Now, another way to look at the numbers is to look at them in terms of the questions that are ranked from easiest to most difficult. And now this was my subjective judgment about which questions would be the easiest and ranked in order until they're the most difficult. And when I reviewed the questions after I had developed them, I ranked them as question number 4 being the easiest, and then the questions would get harder. Question 1 was a little harder, 3 a little harder, 9, 10, 2, 5, 6, 8, and finally question 7, in my opinion, I thought that would be the most difficult question for participants to answer. And so there's the order of in terms of order of difficulty under the question number column. And now let's check that. How many correct answers were there for each question? Well, we can see that my assumptions about what the hard questions were and what the easy questions were was not very good. Now I got number 4 right. Number 4 I thought was the easiest question, and it had the highest number of correct answers. Well, I got one of them anyway. Number 7, I thought that would be the most difficult question, but there were other questions that got fewer correct answers than question number 7. So what does this tell us? It tells us that really it's not really possible to assume what others may or may not know or the kind of background or experience they may bring to conformity assessment. We each bring our own set of skills and background and knowledge, but it's all individual case by case with what we have. Finally, I'd like to share with you, and again, there were only 14 participants, but I'd like to share the breakdown of the scoring. You can see here that we did not have any participants that scored a 10 correct, 9 correct, or 8 correct answers. And we had one participant who scored 7 correct answers. Really, almost all the participants scored between 1 and 5 correct answers. And so that tells me that either the questions were a little bit too difficult, perhaps they relied a little too heavily on some very specific details about these fundamental principles, or that I am underestimating the exposure that people have to these fundamental principles. I'm not going to make any assumptions anymore because I have proven to myself that my assumptions are not very good. So I'm just going to meet each person where they are and help them as best I can with conformity assessment. So with that, I'm so happy that you listened to our presentation today, whether you were doing so live or whether in a recording. And I will turn it back to Melanie briefly, and then we'll have some time for Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Keith. That was interesting about the number of questions correct. Before we take a look at your questions, if there are any during the presentation, I wanted to just go over some additional resources that ANAB has available to you. We have many different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management systems, and assessments. On the ANAB website, there are free webcasts on a variety of topics. They're about 5 to 20 minutes long, depending on the topic, and can be viewed at any time. We also have a blog page with a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standards requirements, and many other topics, including a 3-part series on conformity assessment. We also do these webinars monthly. Our next webinar is in December, and it is on the OSAC database for forensic service providers. We offer a variety of different training, both self-paced and instructor-led. We offer in-person and live online training, as well as private training. All of these resources can be found on the ANAB website at anab.ansi.org. If you're watching this webinar after the fact and you have questions about the webinar content or the case study itself, you can contact ANAB at anab@anab.org. If you have questions about training that ANAB offers, you can target that email to training@anab.org. I want to thank Keith for not only putting together the case study, but for presenting at the beginning of the case study's time period and presenting the results here at the end. We had one comment from our audience today that said Pareto at work again, and very illuminating. I think these case studies are a great way to put conformity assessment into the real world, and we do them annually. So keep a lookout next year in 2025 for the 2025 conformity case study.